A good story is one that makes you think about it after you're done reading it or watching it or hearing it or whatnot. An even better story is one where there is no clear-cut distinction between the sides, where the characters are more nuanced and more, well, in tune with how reality indeed functions. Handmaid's Tale, unfortunately, although it has a tremendous premise, really, it has a very good premise. The show, at the very least, I don't care about the book, but the TV show, unfortunately, even though it starts from a great premise, is just not really a good story. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so I was supposed to record this video from Craiova, from one of their nice parks, but unfortunately the weather disagreed. The wind disagreed, and we even got some snow in the deep south of Romania, so well, no recording outdoors, that's for sure. So I guess we'll have to settle with this recording from Vidin, Bulgaria. It is what it is. So the reason my attention was drawn to this very well publicized and mostly ideologically motivated publicized show, Handmaid's Tale, the reason my attention was drawn to it is because in Anno Domini 2023 some protesters from Israel decided to come in with a handmade outfit or costume at one of the ongoing protests going on in Tel Aviv against some Netanyahu policy about judicial reform, whatever. That's not the reason, as we always know with the left. The issue is not the issue. But anyway, so they came in with the handmade costume, and I was like, you gotta be fucking kidding me. I mean, there are many places in the world where maybe such a forced analogy would be, if not appropriate, at the very least understandable, but in the most feminist country in the world, come on, you gotta be fucking kidding me. But I was like, okay, fine. Then I guess if someone bothers to come in real life with such a costume, maybe I should watch the show. So I pirated the show, of course, and I was supposed to watch it while on the train during this 2-week-long trip around the south of Romania and north of Bulgaria. But in the end, I ended up watching the show in 2 afternoons before even boarding the first train. And that's because, well, it's not a good story. I mean, I watched the first 3 seasons at a pace of around 15 to 17 minutes per episode. So, you know, jump to 2 minutes was indeed my best friend in terms of commands on the keyboard. So maybe I should title this video, I watched The Handmaid's Tale so you don't have to. So yes, of course there's going to be spoilers, and also the analysis, if I can call this an analysis. Basically I'm just enjoying the sun because it's the first day without cold. The analysis is for the first 5 seasons. The 6th season, allegedly also the last one, will appear maybe next year, if I read correctly in one of these tabloid blogs. I don't know if I'll ever get to watch that one anyway. So, of course there's going to be spoilers. The first spoiler, if you want to watch The Handmaid's Tale, watch the first 2 episodes, then jump to the last 2 episodes of season 2, and then jump again to the last 2 episodes of season 3, maybe the first episode of season 3 as well, and then only start really watching the show from season 4 onwards. It gets a little bit more interesting from the mid-season 4 onwards. So, the biggest problems with this story is the propensity towards not just plot holes, but I guess I should call it unreasonable expectation of suspension of disbelief. Okay, it sounds a bit too complicated, but essentially every story, every fictional story, whether it's a TV show, a movie, or a book, or whatever, expects from you a certain level of suspension of disbelief, namely that you're not supposed to notice that not all the details perfectly line up, and not all. If you look close enough into the details, you'll realize that the story is probably not plausible. Well, the problem with Handmaid's Tale is that the level of suspension of disbelief that is required from the viewer is just unreasonable. And I was joking in the donor circle, which is probably why I'm making this video as well, because the donor circle narrowly voted that I should. I was joking that you can tell that the show, the source material at the very least, was written by a woman, because the premise is like this. Where continental United States, so not Guam and Alaska and Hawaii, but continental United States gets embroiled into a civil war, and from the ashes emerges the Divine Republic of Gilead. And this Divine Republic, basically, at least in public, from a propaganda perspective, puts great emphasis on environmental policy and fertility policy. The context allegedly is a significant drop in fertility rate in basically every single country on earth, and this terrorist group that ends up taking over continental United States, the Sons of Jacob, they say that they have a better idea, so they stage a coup d'etat and they establish their own republic where they basically force women to give birth, ban contraceptives, they institute a policy of what pretty much amounts to institutionalized sanctioned rape for the most part, and lo and behold, it also has some results, obviously. Whether those results are comparatively worth it from a trade-off perspective, that remains unanswered for the first 4 seasons of the show. The problem is that, so okay, you know, I can buy into that. It sounds like a great premise, and it's quite an attractive premise. I mean, if I hadn't known what I know now about the story and about the author of the source material and whatnot, I was thinking, well, that sounds interesting. I want to see the political struggles within such a regime and whatnot. But you don't get that, unfortunately. And even more, you do get this consistent impression that you're being taken for a ride and taken for a fool, essentially. Now, why am I saying that? Because according to the show, the Divine Republic, the rise of the Divine Republic lasted for maybe a year, even less than a year, several months effectively. So, you know, the Sons of Jacob, a terrorist movement, somehow manages to, just a few terrorist attacks here and there, maybe at Pentagon, maybe at the Capitol, the White House and whatnot, and suddenly they just seize power, and then they start marching on and militarily conquer almost all of continental United States, with the exception of Texas and a few holdouts on the West Coast and Chicago. There's a still ongoing battle in Chicago, Illinois, formerly Illinois, in the story's timeline. I'm sorry, that's just not believable. So you're telling me that a radical religious movement with the possibility, the will to pull out such a thing, somehow managed to develop itself underground over a very short period of time without any interference from the security apparatus, from the deep state, whatever you want to call it, and then they managed to essentially install themselves and overturn the constitutional order within months, and somehow nobody intervenes, and somehow all goes relatively smoothly. And then they managed to pull an entire purge of the American society. It is alluded both in the book and in the show, but particularly in the show, that plenty of mass executions took place and yada yada. Okay, but that's just not believable enough. Now, the existence of such a terrorist movement is believable, but the ability of such a movement to be able to seize power and to keep it, and then to establish a quasi-permanent republic to replace continental United States, yeah, no, that's not exactly believable, at least not in that timeline. Now, if you had told me that, you know, this terrorist movement started developing 50 years before the timeline of the show, and then gradually became popular, capitalized on public discontent. Maybe the society became more religious conservative over time, and they gradually seized power, and then eventually, after they had the majority in most relevant institutions, then they moved towards suspending the constitution and then installing their totalitarian regime. Now that would have been believable, but the idea that the rise of Gilead only took several months is, it requires a level of suspension of disbelief that I'm just not capable of. With that said, then one asks, okay, fine, and what is the resistance? And the first 3 seasons, that's why I'm telling you that you should be watching the first 3 seasons at a fast pace, is because the first 3 seasons, all you see from the resistance to the Gilead regime is, essentially a bunch of handmaids whispering in the supermarkets. I mean, come on. So no, it's not exactly a compelling argument, no matter how you look at it. But then I said it gets a little bit more interesting in season 4. So if you are going to watch this particular TV show, try your best to skip as fast as possible through the first 3 seasons and start watching from the 4th season. It gets a little bit more interesting because finally one of the architects of the Divine Republic is being introduced, and the story starts to make a little bit more sense. And I suspect this is, at least in part, an innovation from the script writer. It's a little bit a deviation from the source material, because you can see that it is the thought process and the thought pattern behind the introduction of Commander Lawrence, the architect of the Divine Republic. Is the person who wrote that portion of the story is not exactly the same person that conceived the first part of the story. In any event, once you meet that the architect, you realize that, in fact, it was all about power, and no, the religious fanatics were pawns into this guy's little game, and his interest was indeed just to increase the number of children being born, and everything else was an acceptable trade-off from his point of view. And in several years down the line, I mean, the action takes place somewhere around 6-7 years after the establishment of the Divine Republic. Several years down the line, he ends up being despised by his wife. Eventually his wife commits suicide, and he realizes that the trade-offs are big as he expected, but some maybe a little bit too big. So he essentially uses his power not to dismantle the regime, but to essentially make his life easier and recruit some more women, in particular, for the resistance, but also a few of the other male commanders, and basically somewhat-ish help the resistance because because he doesn't want the regime to fall. And that's why I'm saying that after the season 4 it becomes a little bit more interesting, because because the pace of the story changes a little bit. You get to see into the politics of the regime a little bit. Unfortunately, and again, this is the downside, and that's why overall I'm rating this show as mostly a waste of time. Unfortunately, since the source material is deeply unfriendly to the interesting parts, maybe I should say, of such a story, unfortunately the source material is unfriendly, so therefore the show is quasi-unfriendly as well. But yeah, so we learned towards the end of the season 5, I think, that the Gilead Republic was still functioning as an unrecognized territory, kind of like a giant Transnistria, but militarily competent, and it was still under various sanctions from all over the world, but at the same time it was still in contact with various powers around the world. So for instance, at some point, what remains of the American government, now in exile with the capital in Alaska, tries to organize an air raid against a school to recover several children who had been abducted by the regime and being kept there, and the air defense system of the unrecognized Gilead Republic function impeccably and take down the American flights. And then you can see the commander saying, yeah, we got in some congratulations messages from Russia and North Korea and China. So, you know, the illusion being that it was politically aware and there was a political struggle there, including internationally, but you just don't get to see that facet that much. So I guess what I'm complaining about is that it's such a shame that the premise of the show is quite entertaining, but the execution is terrible because of the excessive focus of the narrow point of view of one particular handmaid. So, you know, handmaids in the caste system, in the class system of the Divine Republic, the handmaids were legally speaking unwomen. So, you know, the lowest of the low, basically. I mean, just one step above the class of people designated for essentially slow execution. So it's and because of that narrow focus, we don't get to see the more interesting aspects that can be generated from such a beautiful premise. I mean, really, the rise of a theocratic ecologist regime, totalitarian regime in continental United States, functioning as an unrecognized republic with all of the struggles that come from it. Also the regime itself, although it was having a big emphasis on fertility, it did not have a big emphasis on family. So for instance, it particularly disregards biological connections between mother and offspring. So as a result, a lot of drama comes in from that. So the premise is really good, but the execution is just so bad, that at least especially in the first 3 seasons, that it's just not worth it. It should be noted that now that I have actually watched the show, most of the analogies used in the mainstream media with various policies, particularly by the Republican Party in the US, and the analogies with The Handmaid's Tale are disdainful bullshit, essentially. They're just not even similar. In fact, the original author of the source material, Margaret whatever, the author of the book that inspired the TV show, you know, her inspiration was not the Republican Party, it was Nicolae Ceausescu. So in fact, the Gilead Republic is a combination of Bolshevik communism with a focus on fertility, very similar to the Ceausescu regime, although of course even further exaggerated than what the Ceausescu regime represented, and with this twist of at least professing to believe in God, whereas the Ceausescu regime of course did not. But then again, and this is one of the aspects that it is correctly represented in the show. In reality, the whole premise of faith was just for show, for the most part. Most of the commanders were very far away from the pious men that the mythology would portray them, and their wives as well. And of course, the regime purports to have successfully forbidden, successfully banned all sorts of, well, I guess I could call it degenerate behavior, but then in reality, well, not so much. In fact, there were secret places where indeed the commanders would join in to engage in their own favorite brand of degenerate behavior. So there's that. So yeah, all in all, I watched The Handmaid's Tale, so you don't have to. It is simply the kind of show that is nowhere near as controversial as lefties would say it is. It is not even, and by the way, I've seen some political figures accusing the show of being anti-Christian. I think that's wrong as well. It is not an anti-Christian show. In fact, both the quote-unquote positive characters and quote-unquote villains are using scripture to justify their actions, and in fact even the secular neighbor Canada, even there they end up importing some of that, and Canada in fact becomes far more conservative as a result of being of neighboring the Divine Republic. So no, I don't think it is an anti-Christian show. The religious part is in fact quite well depicted, with all of the yes, hypocrisies and I guess what do you call it, idiosyncrasies of having established such a regime which has failed for the time being to also establish international legitimacy. So no, that portion is indeed quite well depicted. Also well depicted are the nuances of characters, but then again after season 4. Until season 4 it's all very clear cut, which I guess also explains why the feminists and the wider left heavily promoted this TV show between 2017 and 2019 or so. But then they stopped talking about it. I suppose it is because of this, because after season 3, especially after season 4, things become a little bit more nuanced, and you realize that the villains aren't exactly the villains, and maybe they had a point, and the so-called good guys aren't exactly the good guys, and in fact the good guys can turn into villains as well. That's a part that is very well represented. But again, after season 4, and unfortunately it's one of those shows that just starts terribly and creates a very bad impression overall, because half of the show is just unwatchable. So yeah, I don't know, if you want to watch Handmaid's Tale, do as I say, because you'll thank me later for having saved up time. And I hope someone comes up with the idea to make a spin-off of this and focus more on the politics. I mean, towards the end of season 5, they discuss the Gilead regime, the leadership discusses to create, and they even call it like that, let's call it our Hong Kong. One country, two systems. They want to create they call it the new Bethlehem, and it's a kind of an island where there is in fact a lot more personal freedom, and on that island there are no executions. The harsh laws of the Divine Republic don't exactly apply, and then the potential international partners of Gilead, who in fact loved the idea that they managed to increase fertility, but they despise the trade-offs that had come with it. They're like, well, should we trust this new commander, this new guy that comes in with some reforms? I mean, maybe he's a Gorbachev. I mean, that's an actual line from the show. Maybe he's a Gorbachev, but what if he ends up being followed in power after him by guys like Putin? So, this is also a nod to the fact that the script writer did not go rigorously with the source material. The source material was written in 1985, whereas the show takes place essentially in contemporaneity. The action starts around 2017, so it is, although it is a dystopic show, the action is not supposed to take place in some distant future, but rather, well, tomorrow, which is another problem that I have with the show, because if you're gonna tell me that tomorrow such a regime would rise more or less overnight in just a few months, yeah, you're asking too much of a suspension of disbelief for me, and yeah, I have a problem with that. That's why I generally don't watch shows and don't watch modern movies, because they're just so uninspired. And this one, it's unfortunate that it is the premise is quite inspired, but the execution, for the most part, with some exceptions, it has its good moments for sure, but for the most part is just well, uninspired, and it just doesn't make you think about the issues after you're done watching it. So yeah, that was my rambling review, unscripted rambling review of the Handmaid's Tale. If someone on the other end of the world decides to create a costume from the show and bring it in on a protest, then I suppose it left the realm of fiction, and that's why it deserves well, 20-ish minutes of attention. Okay, that was it. Thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Send me to the killing fields from within Bulgaria. Over and out.